Maya-Spanish Entanglement in Petén, Guatemala by Timothy Pugh, Prudence Rice, and Evelyn Chan. Originally presented at the 2014 annual meeting of the Society for Historical Archaeology in Quebec City, Canada. Cultural contact and colonialism produce novel, hybrid material assemblages embodying and documenting situations rife with cultural entanglement and complex power relations. The Maya of Petén, Guatemala were free from Spanish control, but in distant contact with the Spaniards from 1525 until their conquest in 1697. After the conquest, the Spaniards resettled populations into reduced communities to govern and convert them. Contact and colonialism resulted in some replication of Spanish artifacts and practices, but in some cases, the Maya adopted Iberian objects and practices in novel ways. 3 locations of entanglement discerned by recent archaeological research in Petén, Guatemala include syncretic church construction, hybrid ceramic forms, and innovative uses of Spanish goods. By the late 17th century, the Itza Maya of distant Petén, Guatemala, had become a frustrating obstacle to Spanish control of the Yucatan Peninsula, and their alleged ferocity was an inspiration for indigenous resistance. Spaniards under the command of Martín de Ursúa y Arizmendi attacked and occupied Najpetén, the island capital of the Petén Itza, on March 13, 1697. This attack occurred after 172 years of sporadic interactions with the Spaniards, which began when Hernán Cortés passed through the area in the early 16th century. During the extended contact period, missionaries venturing into Petén to convert the Maya living there recorded some of what they saw on their journeys. They described that the area was largely ruled by the Itza, but the Itza were not alone in the Petén Lakes region at conquest. They interacted with at least 2 other groups, the Mopan and the Kowo. The Itza dominated the Mopan at the time of conquest. The Kowo, who occupied the northeast portion of the Petén Lakes region, were the principal rivals of the Itza. In the early 17th century, the Itza began to expand into areas of Belize and Chiapas in an effort to drive Spanish missionaries from these regions which bordered their own territory. Although the Petén Maya were isolated from conquest during their extended contact period, they certainly felt the biocultural impact of the situation of contact. Epidemics and famine spread through the Maya area and decreased populations. The area may have experienced 8 pandemics and 25 smaller epidemics during the contact period, and post-conquest epidemics severely impacted mission settlements. Migrants fleeing from the Spaniards in Yucatan and Belize also contributed to biocultural change. In addition to the biocultural impact, Petén was culturally affected. Maya who fled missions in Yucatan and other colonized areas brought ideas as well as objects with them. Itza expansions into Spanish-controlled areas also brought foreign objects and ideas. Finally, Spanish goods trickled into the region through indigenous trade networks. One trading center, Expimienta, was ruled by indigenous priests dressed in Spanish-style priestly vestments. In sum, the conquest of Yucatan, Chiapas, and the Guatemalan highlands strongly impacted Petén even while it remained politically independent. One major source of change was through objects gifted by the Spaniards that became luxury goods. The Spaniards and other European explorers loaded their ships with objects desired by indigenous peoples, so-called gift kits, which they used to establish relationships and manipulate local politics. Such gifts included glass beads, ribbons, knives, axes, machetes, and even nails, scrap metal, and broken bottle glass. These objects were frequently referred to as trifles or trinkets, terms suggesting that they had little value, which might have been the case in the European world, but in a world in which they were unavailable, yet desired, they were highly valued. Indigenous desires for such unfamiliar objects could be exploited as an initial instrument of social control through reciprocity. Native peoples' longing for the goods was intended to encourage them to settle peaceably under colonial surveillance, in conformance with ideas of Christian civilization and loyalty to Spain. An anonymous painting composed in the late 17th century, likely in Nicaragua, clearly illuminates this strategy. a priest and his assistant pass various items to indigenous people. The painting's legend identifies the objects as cosas para reducirlos, or things to reduce them. In 16th century Spanish, the term reducir meant to be convinced and put in better order, referring to the transformational process, both physical and spiritual, of bringing the idolaters to a civilized state of Christian order. In Petén, evidence for the use of pre-conquest gifted objects is found at the site of Zacatén, which rested in the Cowo area. Zacatén was rapidly abandoned in the early 17th century, leaving Pompeii-like de facto refuse deposits. Spanish objects were found in the two contact period ceremonial groups as well as in an elite residential group dated to the early 17th century. The colonial artifacts encountered at Zacatén appear to have been odds and ends that found their way into Petén. We encountered no pretty objects. The majority of the artifacts were unidentified iron. 3 pieces of iron rested in Group A, a ceremony group, one of which had been cached along the medial axis, directly in front of the temple. Several pieces of indigenous metal, both copper alloy and gold, were also cached along the medial axis. The other pieces of iron were found in ceremonial trash deposits in Group A. One was found in a refuse deposit behind an open hall, structure 615, along with a kaolin pipe stem and an indigenous copper bell. Another may have been an iron celt and rested in refuse adjacent to the other open hall in Group A, structure 606. Group C followed a similar pattern as Group A. A piece of miscellaneous iron and a musket ball were cached in front of the temple stairway, and indigenous copper was found in the temple's central cache. The iron objects in Groups A and C appeared to have been cached and disposed of similar to indigenous metals. Thus, they appear to have been understood and utilized as a subtype of something that was already known. They were most likely classified as taquine or solar excrement. Group 719 of Zacatén was an elite residential group. It included a large residence as well as a domestic temple. The residence included a front room and a back room. The front room was decorated with plaster surfaces and included an L-shaped bench, an interior shrine, and an altar. 2 composite censers rested on the altar. The interior shrine held a complete effigy censer depicting an unknown deity. To the north of the censer was a cow's mandible that had been modified into a roughly triangular shape. We do not know if the mandible was an offering to the deity, but it is unlikely that cows were present in Petén in the early to mid-17th century. Hence, it would have certainly been an exotic artifact. All Spanish objects found at Zacatén either rested in caches or ceremonial refuse deposits in ceremonial groups or in elite residence. While the objects would have been considered junk by the Spaniards, they were valued as powerful things by the Cowo. In fact, they were used in the same manner as indigenous luxury goods. However, as noted by Apadurai, 1986, as these objects were freely appropriated into the system, they became Trojan horses of change, transforming indigenous systems of value and power relations. In other words, they had begun to substitute for and replace indigenous luxury goods, which would have undermined the local exchange and use of such goods. In fact, we found little evidence of the use of indigenous luxury goods other than ceramics in later colonial period sites in Petén. Another site of entanglement is seen in colonial churches in Petén. It has long been known that indigenous practices in churches continued into modern times. However, evidence has also been encountered archaeologically. The mission of San Bernabe was established sometime before 1712 as part of Spanish efforts to subdue Petén, but the community does not appear to have survived into the 19th century. Recent excavations revealed the church primarily through the position of burials and the baptismal font. Associated with the font was a cache containing a nearly complete ceramic drum, fish bones and scales, net sinkers, freshwater snail shells, and decorative sherds such as red-slipped tripod feet. These sherds are critical as they were used by the Itza to mark the location of caches. Complete fish are usually not found in post-classic Maya caches, however, baptismal fonts were associated with fish. Hence the Maya cache within the San Bernabé Church was itself a hybrid performance. One anomalous burial, Burial 24, was an Itza-style interment and did not follow a high medieval burial pattern as the others did. The individual was seated and flexed with the head facing east before it collapsed into the lap upon decomposition. Because it is unlikely that a priest actually lived at San Bernabé, some religious freedom may have existed, but the clear European patterning seen in the other burials suggests otherwise. Burial 24 represent a variation in usual practice for this individual, perhaps as a form of resistance or an attempt to interweave pre-Columbian and Catholic practices. Excavations in many Spanish colonial sites and regions have recovered pottery displaying a mixture of indigenous and European traits, and these are often called hybrid wares. Hybrid wares were made by indigenous inhabitants in some areas of the Americas and by African slaves in others. These and other forms of hybridity at many colonial settlements often have been explained by intermarriage. Africans came into Petén as conquistadors, and slaves escaping English colonies in what is now Belize may have found their way to Petén as early as the 1720s. Many occupied mission settlements by the end of the 18th century. In Petén, however, most hybrid wares appear to have been made by Mayas, perhaps for trade with the Spaniards at the Presidio or with Mayas who desired pottery in this style. One hybrid type has been named Ishkamik unslipped, a type that resembles other late indigenous unslipped wares in some general respects, but differs in being thicker-walled, slightly better finished, and having light tan, rather than reddish-brown, surfaces. The paste is fine and sandy, with a thick dark gray to black core. This type is not a purely colonial innovation. It was present in late pre-Columbian, contact period, and colonial period deposits. In pre-Columbian contexts, Ishkamik unslipped sherds are found in moderate quantities in residential contexts, but in very low frequencies in civic ceremonial contexts, indicating that it was not frequently used for ceremonial activities. In the colonial period, relative frequencies of Ishkamik unslipped increased in domestic contexts and appeared in church deposits as well. Frequencies of red-slipped decorative ceramics decreased in most contexts, though such sherds were still present in caches. One Ishkamik unslipped vessel, a nearly complete pitcher, was found in a house at the site of Nishtunchich. While it was composed of indigenous Ishkamik paste, the vessel form, a water pitcher, had obvious Iberian origins. The form of the water pitcher was a clear example of mimesis. Indigenous pastes were used to create a Spanish form. It was used in an indigenous residence, so this particular example was not produced for Spanish consumption. We have explored just 3 of the sites of entanglement between the Maya and Spaniards: gift kits, churches, and hybrid ceramics. In all cases, one can observe the porosity in the material culture. The use of gifted goods did not match the uses to which the givers would have intended them. The Church incorporates both Spanish and Maya practices, and the Maya practices so incorporated were themselves hybrid. Finally, Spanish-style ceramics were produced with Maya technological style. All 3 examples of contact period and colonial period material culture are neither Spanish nor Maya, but an entanglement of the two.